So delighted to welcome you all joining us for the launch of the Working Families Index. And we're doing this in partnership with our friends at Talking Talent. We've got a fantastic panel here today. Drew Gibson, the Senior Manager of Inclusion, Diversity and Wellbeing at Santander. Lucinda Quigley, as I mentioned earlier, Lucinda's from Talking Talent. She's the Head of Working Parents at Talking Talent. My colleague, Alice Hooley, who is one of our relationship managers. And I'm also delighted to be joined by Ursula Tavender, who is co-CEO of Flexibly, who's going to be moderating the discussion. And before we jump into the panel, I wanted to share some of the findings and key employer recommendations from our report. If you have any questions, and we really hope you do, type them into the Q&A box and we'll get to as many of them as we can in the second half of the webinar. And just to say, everybody, once I've finished the presentation, I'm going to drop off because I'm delighted to say that we've had some press interest. So I'll be doing 2 interviews. So I'd obviously much rather be listening to everybody else's views, but instead, I'm afraid I'm going to be talking on the radio. So hopefully that will be not quite as interesting, of course, as the panel. So welcome. Working Families Index 2022. And I'm hoping that my slides are moving on and I'm getting nods, which is always a good thing. So it's the most comprehensive survey of how working parents and carers are managing in terms of the balance between work and family life in the UK. We surveyed nearly 3,000 parents and carers about their finances, their working arrangements, how they were managing and sharing childcare, and their personal well-being. Childcare, of course, being a huge issue for so many people, because as the OECD says, we have some of the highest rates of childcare costs across Europe. So what do we know? What did it tell us? And we know that parents are finding it tough to manage financially. This is a real challenge for them. 60% of parents agree that it become much more difficult in this financial year, to raise a family. I am desperately looking for my notes, which appear to have fallen off the page, which is unhelpful. So we're not surprised by this. We did this survey in November, and obviously things are only getting worse. So what can you do about it as employers? So the first thing is look to the living wage. Help employees at every level of your business meet those rising costs by offering the living wage with living hours. And support childcare costs, as I mentioned earlier. This is a huge issue for many families, and particularly for anybody who is receiving universal credit and is in work. They are expected to provide those childcare costs up front. And of course, they are only getting those costs later on. So it's a really big issue. And my next, sorry. And what do we know about flexibility? We know that it fosters loyalty. This is an absolutely critical finding within the work that we do. Parents who felt that their family lives were supported and thought that they were being treated fairly by their employer were twice as likely to consider staying with their employer over the next 2 years than parents who didn't feel this way. And that certainly is one of the things that we've known for quite some time. And one of the things that we would really encourage employers to do, as well as training managers, as well as not just asking employees to bring their requests for flexible working to you, but also for you to bring it up with them. And we know that flexible working is one of the things that can be managed and led from the top. If you have real models, people who are actually walking the walk and talking the talk, this can be a hugely powerful force in changing and shifting attitudes. You'll have recently seen that there's a job share happening at one of the really important government institutions, and that kind of flexible working is hugely important. So train your managers, think about coaching, think about training, and get them to bring it up with employees within the one-to-one process. So when we asked about flexible working, one of the things that we're very aware of course, is that flexible isn't fair yet. When we think about our key workers and many people who are in place-based jobs, they're not getting quite the bite of the cherry that we would like them to. While interestingly, over 80% of people are working flexibly, it's in the industries that are shown here. So consulting, anything really that is desk-based or knowledge-based work. And then, of course, the people who aren't getting flexible working tend to be retail, healthcare, engineering, teacher training, and transport. And unfortunately, we know that certainly retail and healthcare and teacher training education there are a lot of women who are working in that field. And for women to not have access to flexible working is really problematic for them. So again, what can you do? Talk to your employees, see if they've got a vision, try it out, give it a go, see what works and what doesn't work. If you get teams to choose their working hours, if you understand what the needs of the business are, then you may find that there are all kinds of creative solutions within your workforce that you haven't actually tried yet. We know that culture matters. 3/4 of the parents we surveyed reported regularly working extra hours. Now, most of them are working extra hours because they actually want to bring in more money. But also quite a few of them are working extra hours because it's either simply expected within the workplace that they're in, or it's expected within their workload, or there's a culture within their organization of working those extra hours. And one of the things that we would always say as an organization is look at job design and make sure that all of the jobs that you've created are human-sized. They're designed to be human-sized. Can they actually be done in the hours that are allocated? And agree ways of working protocols that include people taking breaks, not responding to emails outside working hours, and alerting line managers when people are unable to deliver within working hours. Now, of course, if you are working flexibly, it may very well suit you to do a couple of hours outside of office hours. And we're not talking about changing hours. We're talking about working all of the hours. We don't want people to be living at work. That is really bad for their well-being. Now, we know also flex can be amazing. It is brilliant, but people in part-time roles, largely women, are still at a disadvantage when it comes to career progression. And what is it that you can do as employers to change this? Signal the flex works by publicising the flexible working patterns of newly promoted staff. Advertise your flexible working options on your website so that other people can see, if they're looking to come and work with you, they can see what's available. And make it about output. Measure performance by your results, not where and when the work gets done. And of course, look at your pay and your career progression processes to monitor working patterns as well as gender. We know that the gender pay gap is driven a lot by women's lack of access to senior roles. So again, think through all of those issues. And oops, I think that I have just shared my screen in the wrong way. So guys, thank you so much. That has been a whistle-stop tour through flexible working and through the Working Families Index, which we've done with our wonderful partners, Talking Talent. So I'm going to hand over to Ursula, and Alice will be closing off at the end of the day. So thank you so much for being here. And I'm now rushing off for my media opportunities. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thanks so much, Jane. Good luck with the interviews. Fly the flag for all of us. Hi, everyone. I'm Ursula Tavender, the CEO of Flexpo, co-CEO of Flexpo. I am a proud job sharer with my other joint CEO, Maddie Cole. And before we launch into the panel session, I would love it if we could pull up the poll results, if that's possible. Work the magic behind the scenes. So the question was, how do you support your managers in managing flexible working? We've got a real mix, haven't we? So 56% And 57%, they're the majority of answers. Line manager training on how to manage flexible working and guidance on health and wellbeing while working flexibly. Fabulous there. And just behind that, we've got 49% of you saying that you create flexible team protocols. Great to hear. And then 32% of you saying that you implement communication strategies for flexible teams. 25% saying job design that reviews flexibility for every role, and then a small number of you saying you don't do any of the above currently. But welcome to our discussion today, and we hope that it will provide some really useful insights as to how you can begin. Thank you all for participating in the poll. And now we are going to go to our wonderful panel with some really insightful questions. Can't wait to hear from you. So Drew, welcome. I would love to come to you first, if that's okay. And to ask, first of all, how can employers set themselves up for success and offer a wide variety of flexible working solutions?
Hi, Ursula, and thank you for inviting me. It's great to be here. The research, I think, is fantastic as well. I really enjoyed reading it towards getting a bit of an advanced copy ahead of this meeting. I think it's really insightful. So we've shared that internally already with, you know, all of the different people we can to start that conversation about how we can take some of the findings. In terms of offering that wide array of flexible working that you mentioned, I think at Santander, we talk about it as offering true flexibility, so less about what sort of policies you have as such, but how are you empowering your people to wake up in the morning and choose where they work, when they work, and how to work based on what's best for them. So taking into account whatever their personal situation may be in terms of family commitments, or just in terms of individuality. Some of us work better in the mornings and in the evenings, and vice versa as well, and just allowing us to, I think that's the main thing, empowering and talking to your people and thinking about how you can create those jobs and give the flexibility that you'd like. So that's probably our main guiding principle. How do we go about doing that? I'd say the biggest thing is talking to people. So we did this an awful lot through the pandemic, and it became clear really quickly that whilst people missed being face to face, we also wanted to retain a lot of the flexibility that we had. So we had, so I think there has been quite a lot of anxiety from people about returning to the office or how things were before, and losing. I think as humans, we focus on loss aversion. We focus on what we're losing quite easily. So it became quite obvious to us very quickly that was something that we needed to really focus on and help people back into the office, but in the right way, and retaining lots of that flexibility as well. I think the index, looking through the findings, they really show that true flexibility is the most important aspect of an organization's employee value proposition. So again, talking about how competitive it is out in the market as well, and how people are quite literally voting with their feet and moving around as well. So I think that's the biggest takeaway from the index, is just adding to the weight of evidence that's already saying, if you're not focusing on this flexibility as the absolute core of what you're offering to your people, I think that's where some organizations are going to really struggle and start losing out, I think. The other thing that I just wanted to focus on in terms of flexibility or different types is focusing on differences between groups, so particularly the unequal impacts on gender. So we've seen that throughout the pandemic, and the need to promote more equal gender and caring roles in particular if we want to make real progress towards gender equality. So how are you empowering and encouraging your men to care as well? There's also a lot of evidence out there that's saying that men actively want to take a more active role, but are sometimes worried about their peers, or not necessarily supported by their organization, or feel that psychological safety to talk up and go against what has been seen as normal in the past as well. So it's how our organizations really helping to get rid of that stigma that can still exist around it as well. I'm really lucky that I've had shared parental leave once. I'm about to have shared parental leave a second time, and honestly, I can't imagine not doing it, to be honest, because it's a really fantastic thing to be able to do. And I spoke about loss aversion, but what the pandemic did, I think, for many men is had them at home or working flexibly or in a different way than they ever had before as well, and it let them see what we'd been missing, I think, in a lot of cases, of being at home and taking a more active role as well. So I hope that that's something that will be a real benefit that we'll see going forward, and a catalyst for those more equal gender caring roles as well. But again, I'm also just thinking about the impact on people from minority ethnic backgrounds. Again, this research is showing that the impact is bigger here for this as well. And also the growing amount of people that are either sandwich carers or caring for people, elderly relatives or adults with additional needs or needing more support as well. So it's really, really starting to think about those groups and how you can help those people when you're looking at flexibility in particular.
Absolutely. And what you've just said, Drew, touches on so many themes from the index, doesn't it? You know, the culture is key thing, you know, and the difference that a supportive culture makes to that psychological safety piece. And, you know, just, yeah, there's so much there that we could talk about. Thank you so much for sharing all of those insights. Lucinda, I would love to come to you next with the same question, if that's all right. So just again, to refresh your memory, how can employers set themselves up for success and offer a wide variety of flexible working options?
Thanks, Ursula. And yeah, so building on what a lot of Drew said, which I think was so important and resonated very much with me. You know, at Talking Talent, we work with groups of people and companies ultimately to help them to build inclusive cultures. And I think, you know, what it really starts with actually is having a really solid diversity, equity and inclusion policy in place, because really only through doing that are you going to be able to recognise all of the different people that need support within your company. So I think it has to start there, and you know, building on what Drew was saying about, you know, dads absolutely, or you know, men in particular needing more support in the workplace and not being recognized for the roles that they want to play. But also when we think about working families, you know, they're not all the same. The needs are very, very different, and that may be based on you know, the culture of that family, whether it's a single parent, whether it's someone also with extra caring responsibilities. So I think, you know, there's something about recognizing and really listening to all of the different groups within your individual company to understand what they need. And that needs to be continuing and not just a kind of one-off thing that you do at the start. And I think once you have that, I think there's something about, you know, just really understanding then what works outside of the policy, but what works in practice. So what are you seeing in the business that works really well for different people, and shining a light on that, you know, and showing people and taking away some of the, you know, the scariness about it. So really creating role models within businesses for people who are making it work. And I think being willing to trial things, you know, being willing to say, okay, let's have a go at this. Let's empower our people to give it a go, put the right parameters in place. And then if it doesn't work for whatever reason, allowing, you know, that both parties to be able to have that open and, you know, honest conversation about it. But I really think, you know, it's not just about, you know, start with the policy, but then really understand what is going on for these individuals on a daily basis. Because we know, you know, there was an article out last week that half of the UK employees are, you know, would threaten to quit if they aren't offered the flex that they need. And we also know that these people are talent. You know, they're real talent within businesses that need to be looked after and given the right space to be able to ask for what they need. So I think, yeah, absolutely, you know, shine a light on those great role models, and give your managers the confidence to be able to have those conversations.
Absolutely brilliant advice there. Thank you so much, Lucinda. Alice, same question for you, please.
Thank you, Ursula, and good morning, everyone. I think just to expand on both of the points that Drew and Lucinda have made, one of the key things I think in what is now an exquisitely tight employment market is making sure that we actually have these external comms about what we're doing as organisations as well. You know, shouting about it in terms of when that person lands on that job advert. You know, if you see just a scrolling list of these roles are full-time, you're probably going to just click away and go and look for another organisation. Zurich implemented a fantastic flexible working policy where every role had full flex. They did that pretty much overnight, and they made sure that that was communicated both from an external and an internal perspective. Lucinda's mentioned there about role modelling behaviours, and Drew is clearly a fantastic role model for this type of work anyway, but we need to ensure that those are outward facing conversations that we have as well. I think just two other points that I want to make on this, actually. I think when it comes to sort of organisational function, it's very important that we accept that different teams do different things. We saw this so broadly within our membership organisations during the pandemic, because they were having to work in a different way. That whole-scale loss of childcare and support for individuals who needed care meant that people just didn't have the free time in the time slots that they had before. So potentially roles that were that 9 to 5 became 8 till 3, and then 5 till 7, or whatever it needed to look like for that business area. And because those organisations were focused on output, it meant that individuals were actually able to still do the responsibilities that they needed external to their job role, and actually keep that balance between their work and home life. And Drew's touched on that in terms of you know, the role that he is now playing in terms of his family life as well. And we need to be sure that we're making it an equal opportunity for all genders. And I think the pandemic has actually given us a unique opportunity now, but we need to keep hold of that. And Jane mentioned this in her opening comments, but one of the key things that we see as a success in terms of changing how jobs function, and 25% of our poll respondents there mentioned it, it is around job design. You know, we look at a role, and pre-pandemic, I think, you know, there was much more rigidity around how a role functions and where it needs to be undertaken. The pandemic has shown that actually there's a greater level of flex than we ever thought possible, and that is backed up with the reporting of the Working Families Index. But we need to ensure we're not just creeping back to place-based flex. It's not about where we're doing the work. It's making sure that we're also accessing all the different types of job opportunities. Ursula, it was wonderful that you're here as a job share. You know, Jane was mentioning there the fact that the head of GCHQ is actually a job share. Can't know purposefully who those people are, of course, but, you know, to have those women in that level of power actually working together and alongside each other. You know, 6% of the work that is seen as flexible, 6% is a job share. That's a huge untapped opportunity within the job market, I think, and something that, you know, employers need to look at in more detail. But what other work can individuals do? Part-time, annualised hours, internal shift swapping, thinking about how the shifts fit the person. Appreciate that's probably got a little bit more administrative burden behind it, but in this tight job market, I think that's the way that we're going to need to go. So we need to be clear about how jobs can be designed to fit what's needed now in what is a very different job market to 2 years ago.
I think you raised, again, there's cans of worms being opened all over the place, isn't there? You know, so many questions buzzing around in my brain. So thank you all so much. But I think, Alice, to your point around the job design piece, what COVID has forced employers to do is to be more creative than ever, right? And so that led to what we've seen has led, you know, to much more creativity around how roles can be performed safely during the pandemic, and then, you know, beyond the pandemic, how we can take some of that learning and that creativity and innovation into this post-pandemic period. And with the companies that we work with, we've seen some really, really innovative practices around, you know, flexible start and finishing times. I'm talking about in place-based roles, which previously would have been seen to, you know, not lend themselves so easily to flexibility. And also to, we've seen teams making flexible working part of the development conversations with individuals, where, you know, if you're in a role in manufacturing or, you know, as an example, and you do want to be able to work remotely, could some of your tasks where you do report writing or administration, you know, once or twice a month, could you work remotely? And as part of your development conversation, could you acquire the skills that you need to move into a different role internally, which would give you the level of flexibility from a location point of view that you need. But primarily, how can we, in your current role, flex your hours so that this works better for you? So yeah, it's there's so many different themes that we could pick up on here. I would just also encourage our audience, if you have any questions that you would like to put to our wonderful panel here, what we're going to do after we've finished the panel discussion is come to you and your questions. So just drop them into the Q&A at the bottom on the menu bar there in the middle, and our brilliant Working Families team behind the scenes will show me the questions, and then I can come to those after we finish the panel session. Thank you. So my next question for you is, again, coming to Drew first, if that's all right. How do you then, we're getting into the nitty gritty now, how do you manage a flexible team? I want to talk about policy a little bit, but it's not just about the policy, is it? It's also about those culture and attitudes that we've talked about. So over to you, Drew.
Thank you. Some of it, a fair bit of it has been touched on in the first question as well, I think. But so if the question is how do you manage a flexible team, I'd focus in on managers. So how are you empowering managers? And that, rather than policies as such, which are part of the answer, if you want to empower your managers, it's really, really sending the message to them that what we want you to do is talk to your team and come up with what is the best way of you working based on what you think is going to be most productive, successful and sustainable over the longer term, because a lot of that information is going to be local rather than at the organizational level. But how do you go about empowering managers to feel that way? And that's where that tone from the top that's already been mentioned really, really comes into it. So the role of your leaders is to come out and say, we want you to work however works best for you, based on you know what work you have to do, you know what the requirements of the role are, the different tasks. And don't get me wrong, at Santander we have different populations and roles, some of which might be more customer facing roles, or in our branches or our contact centers, where what works locally is different than in other areas. But it's getting that power out to the managers to be able to make those decisions, but having a really people-focused approach on it. So when I say sustainable in particular, that's where you're really getting into what works for your people, so that you're going to be able to retain, attract, and reward the most developed, talented people that you can, which is going to be beneficial for the business in the long run anyway. One of the other things that I was just going to touch on in terms of how do you promote that flexibility, if you've got the tone from the top, you've also got how you can get the message there culturally from the bottom of the organization as well, or across all levels of it. A really important way we do that is through our family and carers network here at Santander. And it's a really good example of how it spans all levels of the business, actually, because they have our executive sponsor that sits on our executive committee, and we also have a board representative that represents that network as well. But the network itself is how we make sure we're listening to our people and responding to them. And going back to that example of men wanting to take a more active role, that's where that voice is coming through to us and talking to the organization and helping us realize and adapt and prioritize where we're looking. So especially both in terms of that being one example, another being in terms of the increasing need to support working carers more generally beyond working families as well, and helping us shape our response to the pandemic and what hybrid working is going to look like for us as well. So our network are really, really key for that, but also providing that valuable peer support as well. So helping managers understand what they might be able to do best, but helping our people as well. So one thing I'm really proud of is they offer some direct peer support through community groups for either becoming a parent or fertility and baby loss as well, so that people can get in a room and talk about their experiences, what went well, what didn't, and where it could improve as well. And that all feeds back into how we aim to support our people, and particularly focusing on empowering those managers.
Thanks so much, Drew. Some of the work that we've been doing is around giving teams the tools to have those conversations. So I think, you know, everything that you just talked about, the thread is communication, right? It's about talking, you know, we're humans. We need to talk to each other to find out what's really, really going on. And I think providing so many different ways for people to do that is such an amazing start, isn't it? And for them to have that framework to then have that conversation about what flexibility looks like on an ongoing basis, because people's needs change, people's preferences change. So yeah, there's some really great stuff there for our audience. Thank you so much, Drew. Lucinda, what do you think about how you can manage a flexible team?
So I think what Drew was saying near the end of his points there around all of the different reasons which people might need to work flexibly, both on a on a permanent basis, but also on an ad hoc basis as well, when there may be challenges that they're experiencing. And I think that's really important for employers to have awareness of as well, is that sometimes these things might need to change and flex. And I speak to a lot of working parents, and one of the things that I know they worry about is that if they choose a flexible working pattern, that's the one that they're stuck with forever, and that's what they've got to stick to. So I think employers need to offer fluidity and really, as we've said, have those open conversations. But I think that point around having a challenging experience as an individual, whatever that might be, Drew mentioned around, fertility challenges or, loss, those kind of things can happen to anybody. It's not just someone in a family, a traditional family situation. So I think there's something around empowering managers to have, if you like, a toolkit of how do they deal with those situations. So, how can they have conversations with people or create the safe spaces where people can have conversations, but also what are the things that they've got within the company. So do they have a network, as Drew just said? Do they have an EAP provider, and what can they get through that? What can they offer to people? And also for managers to be okay with the fact that sometimes they're not the right people to talk to, in these situations. They don't have to fix it. They just have to be there to create that space for these people to have these conversations. So I think that's really important. There's, I think, the culture around bringing home challenges into the workplace is changing. We hear a lot more about the menopause now, which is really important. But I still think companies can do more to create those environments where people can feel comfortable talking about the things that are challenging to them. I think when you think about managers in general, around how can managers manage a flexible team, so I think the one word that comes up for me is trust. How do you enable managers to create an environment where everybody trusts each other? And again, this shouldn't just be about the families or carers. This should be about everyone in the team coming together to talk about, well, what works for us? And of course, managers might need upskilling here. They might need some development to help them have these conversations. Coaching skills are really important, obviously, in these conversations. But I think engendering a culture of trust within a team is really going to help when we're talking about how do we manage people flexibly. Because I think the other challenge that comes up is, I quite often when I'm speaking to managers get this issue of, well, actually, how do we make sure that we're removing questions around performance management from conversations around flexible working? Because I think that can come up sometimes, and it shouldn't. It should be a completely separate conversation. But managers need help with that. They need to understand what they should be doing in these different circumstances, and removing any concerns about performance management from decisions around, how someone should be able to manage their work in order for them to also have the home life that they need.
That is such an important distinction. Thank you so much for bringing that up, Lucinda. Alice, how can teams manage working flexibly?
Thank you. I think quite a lot of it has already been commented upon, but I'm just going to pick up on a couple of areas. So I think we've talked about communication, but one of the key things here is, as we're delivering this via a screen, I think those informal moments of conversation, which we've lost from being in an office, we need to ensure that those still exist. So having those water cooler kind of turn up with your cup of tea and chat through what your day has been like points are so important, not just from a team perspective, but also from a line manager perspective, so that they can just start to subtly pick up if an individual is maybe not coping or needs some extra support, making sure that they actually have those check-in points to see how that individual is getting on. We talked a lot about trust, and I think this really dives into the mental health and well-being piece as well, and it's creating that environment of safety where an individual can actually put their hand up and say, do you know what, I'm really struggling right now, I'm missing the connectivity that I had within my office space, please can we have a further conversation about it, so that they actually do get the support they need, whether that's from the line manager, as Lucinda mentioned, but it could well be from different pathways. And so line managers truly knowing and understanding where they need to look to ensure that they get that support through whichever pathway it is. But I think the key thing, and one of the areas that I just want to lens back in on, it's everybody taking personal responsibility for their flexible working arrangements, for the communications of those through email, diary and administrative management, but also role modelling those own behaviours. Because actually, if we see senior staff and senior leaders nipping out to get the kids or undertaking, you know, a caring responsibility role, then we're going to feel empowered and we're going to have the ownership to say, I can do that too. And we're seeing so many positive examples of that. But if we just go back again, considering that gender balance piece, particularly if we have senior men doing this too, then it makes sure it sends that message, doesn't it? That actually this is okay because we have work, but we also have life.
Thank you so much, Alice. That brings our panel discussion to a close. And what I would now like to do is throw out some of your incredible questions, which I've just been having a very quick scan through in the Q&A section to our brilliant panel. So I think it would be remiss of us in a webinar about flexible working not to bring up Boris Johnson. So my first question, I'm going to dive straight in with one about Boris. So thankfully someone has brought this up and kept themselves anonymous in the attendee list. So our question is, Boris Johnson recently characterised people who work from home as, and I'm going to try not to have a sarcastic tone in my voice, as walking back and forth to the refrigerator and hardly getting any work done. So the question for you is, how do we combat these old school attitudes and get leaders to understand, finally, the benefits of flexible working? So who of our wonderful panel would like to start with this?
Yeah, I can go for it. I think it can be quite damaging when people are saying things like that. I think it's probably a good thing. I don't know how seriously some of the things that are said are going to be taken, and I would like to think a lot of serious organisations wouldn't be paying that much attention to things like that. I think a lot of organisations were already looking at how we can work more flexibly and promote this anyway. The pandemic has just acted as a catalyst for that, and I'd say in general, if you look at government and Westminster and how it functions, it isn't necessarily representative of what businesses and organisations are doing across the country anyway. I'd say they would often not necessarily be on the front foot with it in terms of their working practices. So it isn't something we'd look at as a guide necessarily, I don't think.
So true, isn't it? And I think, you know, the fact that the employment bill was left off of the Queen's speech, again, so a change in legislation around flexible working isn't going to be happening imminently. I think that's fairly sort of safe to say, but the leadership in this change is coming from organisations and not from our government, which is obvious, isn't it? And I think to come back to what we said earlier about the competition out there and the war for talent and the very real threat of losing great people, that angle surely has to be up there in respect of how we convince leaders that, you know, this is a very real challenge that organisations need to be looking at if they aren't already. Thank you so much. I'm going to move on to the next question in the interest of time. So we have some amazing questions. And to pick up on one of the themes within the Working Families Index, around there being a very substantial gap between the availability of flexible working in office-based roles versus location and place-based roles and site-based roles. One of our attendees has asked if the panel can share some of successful working practices that sectors where flexible working is more challenging, such as retail, construction, healthcare, have adopted. So Alice, you're nodding furiously. Do you have something that you would love to share on this, please?
Yeah, I think firstly, it's recognising that this is a challenge, because it is. I think if we look at the NHS specifically as a first example, the pandemic immediately demonstrated that not every task needed to be completed within the confines of that hospital or GP space or wherever that individual practitioner is working from. And that change is still filtering through, but I think that is a key win from the pandemic. And actually we need to be supportive to those practitioners to actually say, right, clinic is done, there's the paperwork, you don't need to sit, wedged in at the nurse's desk with everybody else on a computer that's not really functioning properly. You can just do that activity at home. But I think one of the key challenges is around shift work, which is relevant to all of those sectors. And we have a sort of, I think organisations have this standardised approach in terms of, right, well, the shifts function like this. And we've actually worked with organisations where they start from the perspective of what the prospective employee can offer. Now, that is extremely challenging to start with, if you have a process which actually functions from the other perspective. But actually what then you're achieving is you're getting a member of staff who is totally engaged with you as an organisation and a business, and there's huge amounts of software and platforms that can actually help to fit all these individuals in to actually make those roles function well. But again, it goes back to that line manager piece. How can line managers be skilled to understand what their staff need? One of the other great successes that we have seen is allowing staff to internally shift swap. One of our members, actually, Clwyd Allen, they spoke when we did our webinar on Flex on the front line, and they had huge issues around sickness in their caring roles. So they have supported in caring functions within their portfolio. And what they were realising is that people were actually requesting those sickness days because they had caring responsibilities that meant they couldn't immediately change. So they needed to take that route to actually remove themselves from the business that day. The two things that they undertook to actually implement and support this is they offered carers leave, which we haven't touched on at all today, actually, but I think that's a really positive and important thing to offer, whether that's carers leave or dependent leave, to actually give the people, life happens, right? Things change. But they also implemented an extremely successful internal shift swapping dialogue that meant that if people were struggling to fill that shift, they could call on their colleagues. People particularly, we've heard it again in news reports today, this week, about, well, you could do a bit more work, and that means, we can, that will help. People want to be flexible. They want to work alongside their colleagues. They want to help. So having the internal shift swapping option as well, I think, is a very good route to ensuring that shifts get filled and that, work is still undertaken.
Thank you so much, Alice. Drew, very quickly, do you have anything to share from Santander's perspective in respect of the roles that you have which don't lend themselves to home working or remote working?
Yeah, so we obviously have our branch network and our contact centres as well. So when you're calling Santander and servicing accounts that way, so those sorts of roles. Starting with, yes, it can be more difficult. That doesn't mean it isn't possible or isn't something that we can do. It's a really good example of the pandemic as a catalyst, because as part of that, we very quickly had people who would normally be working in branch supporting with our contact centres, where obviously the volume went away from the high street and onto the phones as well. So those people were quite rapidly retrained. And also with our contact centres, a lot of our people, rather than working in an office, were doing their contact centre work from home. And I think that's pretty much the first time that's ever happened, certainly on anything like that sort of scale. And pre-pandemic, I think that would have been quite far away from something that was seen as imminent in those sort of roles. So it's just totally shifted the idea of what people think are possible, but also those expectations of where people are willing to work. So again, it's those organizations that manage to embed that change over the longer term are going to be much more successful than those that try to go back, I think.
Right. Thank you so much, Drew. Lucinda, I'd love to come to you now with a question on persuading employers, if that's all right. So the question from our audience is, how can we persuade employers to implement equal policies, for example, around parental leave, where these particularly might increase costs to the business?
So, well, I mean, I think it comes back to what we've been, talking about as an undertone through all of this, which is talent ultimately, and really looking at, what are the benefits for doing this? And the big benefit is that, if you don't do this, you are going to lose the key talent in your organization. And I think there are more and more statistics that are now, backing this up. I mean, we know from our own research at Talking Talent that, there are still, many people that will leave jobs because they don't get the flexibility. And that's talking about leaving with nothing to go to as well, because the balance between, childcare and the pay for a lot of people is nothing, and there are lots of people who are actually going to work and not earning anything, but going to work because they want to be there, they want the career, they want to be able to progress. So I think from an employer's perspective, it's really recognizing and thinking about, what do we need for the future in our company? How can we create a space where people are valued and we keep this talent, and recognizing that recruitment, I worked in recruitment in the first part of my career. It takes up so much amount of time and energy. And, I hear so much nowadays, finding the right people is really, really difficult. So I think it's just really working on that balance between, let's focus on retaining talent, creating an amazing space for them, but also recognizing that we don't want our managers spending their time recruiting people in a very, very difficult market.
Great points, thank you. And just staying with you, Lucinda, actually, to continue that thread around managers, we've got a question here. A lot of organisations delegate decisions on flexibility to managers, which means that we have a great swing when it comes to people's experience, right? And it depends so much on the manager, doesn't it? And how the policies are applied, and the culture is permeated, is really affected by the manager. So the question is, how do you break down this dynamic to ensure more consistent approach, and that decisions are made consistently, particularly across large organizations?
Yeah, I think it's really true. And I think some of that happens for a good reason, in that, you are going to get differences in practice sometimes in different areas. There are going to, in a big company, it's going to be, maybe suitable to do, certain types of working and maybe not in another part, as I think we've heard. But I think the biggest thing, and certainly something that we see at Talking Talent, we coach groups of managers together, is actually getting managers to share successes, share stories about what's been happening, what's worked for them, where they've maybe had a go at something, or maybe where something hasn't worked and they've changed it and done something differently. So, as part of the upskilling of managers in order to be able to support their teams, I think actually someone mentioned it might have been you, Drew, around that sort of peer coaching element of bringing managers together to understand how, okay, we've got this policy, but how does it work in practice? How do you make it work? And learning from each other, I think that is really invaluable.
It is, isn't it? And one thing that we've done is create workshops where it's everyone from graduate employees right through to senior leaders, and they're all in a virtual room together, and level the playing field.
Yeah,
so that everyone gets to hear everyone else's experiences. And I mean, it's really, really quite moving and humbling when those senior leaders become quite vulnerable and talk about how challenging they find flexible working. And again, going back to what has already been said around creating that psychological safety to have those conversations in an equal way, where managers can talk about, actually, what I'm worried about, or what I'm fearful of, is getting it wrong and opening up the floodgates. So if I offer you this flexibility, then I've got to offer the same to everyone, and people have those conversations about everything is different. Flexibility is different for everyone, and one size does not fit half the people, let alone all. It's
and I think it's something about the managers knowing that it's not just down to them to make that decision. It's about working with everybody to find the right thing for that individual. So like I said earlier, it's how do you work as a team to work out what's going to work for everyone, so that if that person isn't in the office on that day, then who's going to support picking up that work? So it's that it's that really excellent communication that we want to put in place.
And I think, you know, that is a really, really important thread, isn't it? That managers don't have to have all the answers. So if it's clear to them that they don't, and you can work collaboratively to figure this out, because we're all learning how this is going to work. Yeah, thank you very much. Right, Alice, I would love to come to you next with this question. How can you support these conversations when employees are introverted or have mental health issues? And there's an additional layer of complexity there. The person who's posed the question says, my husband feels bad about making a fuss or being treated differently, even though we have a disabled child. I know my husband could be more vocal, but it's not always easy or natural to everyone. It's a great question. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and I think firstly, it's acknowledging that this is still difficult, and not all industries or businesses are as open for these conversations as others. I think what's really key here is tasking yourself with the knowledge, and you can do that through our legal advice service in terms of what your rights are and what is available to you, so that you feel empowered initially to have those conversations. And I think that's so important. Lots of people, I think, when they're asking for flexibility, are not fully versed potentially in terms of how they are supported by the law. So I think that's really key, and there's huge amounts of information on our website about that. In terms of those individuals with different preferences and different working styles and different needs, I think the challenge is about how do we communicate this. It doesn't need to be necessarily in a conversation like this, which can feel, I think, for a lot of people quite intimidating, quite hard, because you know, they might not even want to put their camera on, you know, to have that chat. So it's potentially finding out what the preferences are for that individual, but it's thinking about those communication strategies from a whole company perspective. You know, can we have some little videos, examples of how it's worked for an individual, so they can feel then that there is some synergy there, some opportunity? Can we have this written down so they can actually take the time to reflect and absorb that information and not feel that they're being put on the spot? You know, does the conversation need to be face-to-face? Could it actually be via email? Obviously, conversation is great because we can start to unpack potentially where the challenges are. But if people don't feel able to do that, then again, from a line manager perspective, it's asking what is going to work best for that person, but also for that person really to have that own internal understanding about what's going to work best for them, and being able to say that. And that really, it links back to the two of the main themes I think we've come to here. It's about communication, but it's also about that trust and feeling psychologically safe within the workplace as well.
That's a really great note to end on. I think those are two very important things that have come up through every single answer that each of you have given today. Now, there's a real fantastic library on the Working Families website of case studies and employer examples, isn't there, Alice, of you know, more insights and more kind of evidence that might be useful for our audience. On behalf of, well, myself and Working Families and Talking Talent, thank you so much for everybody's questions, and to the panel, thank you so much for your brilliant insights. I am going to hand over to Alice. Before I do that, I would just like to say how much I have enjoyed and gained from this conversation. So thank you all very much.
Thank you, Ursula, and can I please just give my thanks to both Lucinda and Drew for joining me today and for sharing such insightful and interesting points with our audience. I do hope that everybody who's dialed in has had some great takeaways. We had some questions in the chat as this was going on about the research that we've been mentioning, our Working Families Index in partnership with Talking Talent. That is now live. It's available on our website. So there is the highlights report and also the employers report, which Jane referenced in her slides, and has some very you know, good examples to be working towards in terms of your changes potentially that you're looking to make. So thank you so much for joining us today. Please visit workingfamilies.org.uk to view the Working Families Index. It will be shared via email as well. We'll be in touch, obviously, to share with you how to embed flexible and family-friendly practices within your organisation. But thank you very much for joining us, and I'm wishing you the very best of today and the rest of this week as well. Thank you all.